Hello and welcome to the sixth of my series of talks on the Buddha's Middle Way. And so this one is about craving, karma and conditionality. This series of talks goes side by side with my book, The Buddha's Middle Way, which you can see next to me here, which was published by Equinox in 2019. So I'm just going to briefly recap where we are in the succession of talks, and then we'll get into this talk's topic. So far I started off by talking about the Buddha's early life and the relationship between the Middle Way and Enlightenment, Buddha's ministry, including his first address or first sermon, and then I've also talked about the issues with the Middle Way and Buddhism, or the way Buddhism has expressed the Middle Way, and also last time the Noble Eightfold Path. So far basically I've been stressing how the Buddha provides inspiration for the Middle Way, so that's how I see the Buddha as being significant. Not necessarily that we have to have beliefs about what happened historically, but that he provides a symbolic inspirational story. And I've also talked about why the Middle Way is prior and is the crucial achievement by which we should judge other things, and how that interprets or affects our interpretation of the path as a whole, so putting the Middle Way first. So in the third talk I talked particularly about the first address of the Buddha, and I talked a bit there about the Four Noble Truths, as they're usually called, that Stephen Batchelor calls the Four Tasks. So that's quite a good starting point for what we're going to talk about today, craving, karma and conditionality. So particularly the second of those tasks, or which are related to the second Noble Truth as it was traditionally called. Maybe I can just remind you before we go any further about a crucial concept which I introduced in earlier talks, that is that of reinforcing or adaptive balancing feedback loops. So you can see the second Noble Truth, so-called, or the second task, really is focusing on reinforcing feedback loops and why we get stuck in them. So why do we end up constantly reinforcing the beliefs that we start with through our actions, and then our whole view of the world, and then the way we select from what we perceive? Why do we get stuck in that way? So that we're incapable of learning in ways we need to learn from new experiences. So that's kind of the question that we'll be asking more than anything in this talk. The first task, or first Noble Truth, which comes before that, is more about how it feels when that reinforcing feedback loop is disturbed. So the first task, which is often translated as suffering, which I don't think is a good translation at all, frustration might be better, is really how we feel when we get disturbing new input. We're in our rut, going round and round, our beliefs that fit in with our selection of information from the world. We're doing things in this particular entrenched way, and then something new happens to disrupt us, which may feel like suffering. It's certainly frustrating to have what we normally want interrupted, normal ways we want it interrupted, and to have to reconsider and reframe. So we're going to focus now then on basically how we get stuck in the rut in the first place, more than anything. So might help also there to think about the wheel of samsara, or the wheel of life, as it's sometimes called. Yeah. So there are many images of the so-called wheel of samsara, or wheel of life. It's a standard teaching aid in Buddhism, and it's a diagram really which particularly focuses on those three things that I'm talking about today. So craving, karma, and conditionality. In fact, to try and make this more visible, I'm going to try and focus in a bit more on the center of it so that you get a bit more detail. Yeah, so in the center of the wheel, you can see the three animals. So the three animals are what drives the wheel around and around. And so there's the cock and the snake and the pig. The cock representing, or rooster if you're American, representing craving, and the snake representing hatred, and the pig representing delusion. So there's a central point there, a central idea in Buddhism that our reinforcing feedback loops, our tendency to get stuck going round and round, is due to those three things working together. It's the relationship between them which drives the wheel. So craving is central, is what's seen as the driver of it. Hatred is really, you can understand hatred just in terms of craving because it's frustrated craving. If we don't get what we want, then we start hating what is standing in our way. So hatred can really be subsumed under craving. But the relationship between craving and delusion is that between desires and beliefs, and that's a central thing to try and understand, I think, well, to understand the middle way as well. It's very much about the relationship between desires and beliefs, and how those can fall into particular patterns, which I call absolutization, which are typical of both extremes of the middle way that we're trying to avoid, negative or positive extremes. So craving and delusion go together, and as we'll see, you can make better sense really of craving if you see it in relation to delusion rather than just by itself. But in the rest of the wheel of samsara, as it's called, you can also see the falling and the rising figures. That's in the next ring, just outside the three animals in the center. And then beyond that, there's the 6 realms, which traditionally are realms you could be reborn into. They can also be interpreted psychologically as states you could get into. And yeah, so that's really about what Buddhism traditionally calls karma. So the effects of actions, how you may end up, how your life may be changed by what you do, by how your life may be changed by the loops, the reinforcing feedback loops you get into or get out of, and how you may manage to improve your situation. So there's a basic insight before we get into the details, and obviously the devil is in the details, but there are some basic insights there which I think Buddhism offers us, which are to do with how reinforcing feedback loops create the basic problem for us, how craving and delusion must be related in understanding that problem, and how reinforcing feedback loops have negative effects on us because they get us stuck in particular realms, particular states of mind or life where the effects of our previous actions have made us get stuck, if you like. Now, again, before we get into the detail, that's just an overview, of some of the key things we could get from it. So, for example, just in the Wheel of Life, there's the what I often call the Titans in the top left-hand corner. who are fighting the gods. So they're in a state, caught in a state of envy, and are often compared to capitalists, who are competing with each other all the time. Yeah, that's just one state of mind we could get caught into due to the ruts that we've encountered, due to the reinforcing feedback loops. Okay, so and then the third thing I'm going to be talking about is conditionality, which is traditionally represented by the 12 links or nidanas around the outside of the wheel of life. I'm not going to be going into the details of those, which would take a long time in this talk. You can find many more traditional Buddhist accounts of them, I'm sure. But yeah, they do need to be at least mentioned in relation to conditionality, and the whole wheel is a representation of what Buddhists call conditionality, or Aticca Samuppada, or dependent origination. There are various translations of it. Okay, so that's the sort of wider context of what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to now focus on craving specifically, and the question of what craving is and how we respond to it. So the central, well, the word perhaps we should start off with that's used in Buddhism for craving is tanha, which literally is supposed to mean thirst. So often that's associated with, well, I suppose the bad, sticky, unhelpful aspect of desire. But there's an ongoing debate and difficulty, I think, in the interpretation of Buddhism here about whether it's in its account of craving, Buddhism is in effect talking about all desire, or whether it's just talking about a specifically difficult, sticky desires. And there are inconsistencies and difficulties with however it answers that question, I think. So I think there were three ways of interpreting craving in Buddhism. So I'm going to talk about two sort of traditional ones, which you could call, for lack of a better term, the Nirvanic interpretation and the Abhidharmic interpretation. And then I'm also going to suggest a third one, which I think is more helpful, which you could call the integration model. Okay, so the first of those kinds of desire, or interpretation of what craving means, would be basically that craving is desire. That there's only really one kind of desire, that all our desire is to some extent, in some ways, craving. So this is the view, basically, that all desire is ultimately bad, and that's the implication, I think, really, of the idea that we need to get free of desire to become enlightened. So this is a particular, you could see it as a popular Buddhist interpretation, but you could also see it as implicit in many of the doctrines of Buddhism, even though, as we'll see later, there is another approach to this within Buddhist doctrines, traditional Buddhist doctrines. So included in that desire is craving for existence, traditionally. And our craving for existence, so our desire to actually continue to exist, gives us rebirth, or is responsible for the fact that we are reborn. So on that way of thinking, even our most basic instincts, just to continue existing, are at some level considered bad, or something we should transcend or go beyond in order to become enlightened. And this view of desire is reinforced in a sutta, a discourse in the Pali Canon, which is called the Aganya Sutra, sometimes seen as like the Buddhist book of Genesis or something, because it tells this story about a supposed origin of people. But basically, it tells the story about how people start off being very subtle and incorporeal, and then they gradually get grosser as they get seduced by desire, and the desires gradually get grosser, and they get grosser to go with the desire. So they start off being ethereal, beings, and they end up by eating this sort of attractive honey-like stuff, they end up gluttonous and passionate and so on, and they end up differentiated by sex as well. So the idea is that this sort of paints this image of humans as potentially free of desires, but then weighed down by them because they've given way to their passions. I find it a very depressing sutra, I must say. And I'm surprised that Buddhists are as happy with it as they often seem to be, or accepting of it as they seem to be. So that's the view of desire that that goes really with the idea that enlightenment is getting rid of it, is getting rid of desire altogether. But of course, there's an obvious difficulty with that as far as the Buddha is concerned, because the Buddha was obviously supposed to be enlightened and he's walking around with a body. But the traditional account of this is that, sure, the Buddha has a body, but that's only because of his residual karma. So perhaps I could even show a traditional picture here of two statues in Sri Lanka of Buddha. So there's a standing Buddha there. These are both carved out of the same rock. There's a standing Buddha, and there's also, you can see the beginning there of the reclining Buddha. So the standing Buddha is obviously the Buddha alive and teaching, but the reclining Buddha represents the Buddha at the time of his death, of his parinibbana, as it's called. So the parinibbana is the point where the residual karma has made its way out of the system, as the traditional explanation goes. So, I mean, this all depends, I think, on a very absolute and literalistic view of karma and enlightenment. Obviously, I'll say a bit more about karma later, but the odd thing about it is that the Buddha is apparently walking around living, doing the things that living people do, without any desire for life, which seems very odd and contradictory to me. This is, basic desires are, and the desire to live is a basic function of being human and of being alive and being organic and all that. So I find a big contradiction in that view of things. And it's also associated with a perception that obviously a lot of Buddhists feel is unfair, that Buddhism is somehow anti-life. But judging on this, it's not entirely an unfair perception. And linked to this is the idea that there's really the monastic lay split. So the idea that lay people, as opposed to monastics, have to put up with continuing mundane desire, so-called, whereas monastics can focus on enlightenment and getting rid of their desires. So there are lots and lots of problems with this influential aspect of, or influential way of interpreting craving in Buddhism. And the odd thing is it continues to have an influence even alongside the other interpretation, which I'll mention in a minute. But it's basically an antibody or Platonic kind of view of the body and its desires. It goes very much with the Platonic idea of the body as a prison, rather than what our experience of it is, which is that it's an enabler. All our more complex mental functions and subtle experiences and so on depend on the body. So the denial of embodiment is not going to help us. It's going to prevent us from addressing the basic conditions of our experience, as the Buddha's experience in finding the middle way underlines. So there's this huge contradiction, I think, between the Buddha's discovery of the middle way and this kind of view of craving. So, and as I mentioned, it creates the monastic lay divide, really because it's so impossibly demanding to get free of all desire that only specialists can be envisaged to be able to do that. So the lay people just have to support the monks and hope for a better rebirth. And the basic confusion behind this view, I think, is to confuse integrative states, or more spiritual states, as some will call them, with incorporeal states, as though we were better off if we had less body, as it were, rather than the body being a basic condition for everything we do. But obviously our whole experience is totally interdependent with our bodies. You don't have to be any kind of materialist to believe that. You just have to recognize complete interdependence between different aspects of our experience. And of course, in many Buddhist contexts, practices of mindfulness, body awareness, yoga, and so on are well recognized. You know? So that, again, I find a yawning contradiction between this view and those practices. But it's still influential, and it also particularly notoriously in the context of Triratna Buddhism, and Sangharakshita led or was one of the major justificatory elements of the notorious book Women, Men and Angels, which was written by Subhuti but expressed Sangharakshita's view. So Sangharakshita, the leader of Triratna, who died a few years ago, came to the conclusion, based very much on this Platonic view of desire, that women were at a spiritual disadvantage compared to men because they were more biological. So that's not just very dodgy in terms of what it assumes about men and women, but also it's dodgy in terms of what it assumes about spiritual or integrative practice in general. It's disembodiment. Okay, so that's enough about that interpretation. Now, let me go to what is another alternative traditional Buddhist explanation, which makes a bit more sense, but still has disadvantages. So I'm going to call that the Abhidhammic interpretation. So in the Abhidhammic interpretation of craving, there are two kinds of desires. So broadly speaking, those kinds of desires are good and bad. There's good desire and there's bad desire. So the terms for those vary a bit. They're sometimes known most strictly perhaps as Kama Chanda and Dhamma Chanda. So you might find Theravadins using those terms for desire for enlightenment as opposed to desire which leads you around the wheel. Sometimes they're also known as Chanda versus Tanha. Or there's a very interesting paper by a guy called Robert Morrison that discusses Tanha and analyzes Tanha, and basically decides there's two kinds of Tanha. So it doesn't make a lot of difference what you call it. Whatever it is, there are two forms of it, two levels of desire, if you like. So what's often called Chanda, let's call it Chanda, is seen as the desire for enlightenment, the kind of desire which helps us to progress and helps us to open up to those balancing feedback loops so that we're not stuck in the same processes all the time. But Tanha, on the other hand, or craving or bad desire, is much more sticky and entrenched. I mean, obviously, biologically, you could associate that sort of sticky desire or that obsessive desire with what's known as the reptilian brain. So the kinds of more the basic cravings, but also basic anxiety, which we can get from the more elementary or primeval elements of our brains, which are shared with, the name suggests, with reptiles going back through evolution. But so those desires, we're stuck with, obviously, but they can be more or less contextualized by the forebrain, by our more human forms of awareness, our conceptual and contextual awareness. So you could one way of understanding the split, as it were, would be that Tanha or sticky craving is just unalloyed reptilian brain craving or hatred, whereas the desire for enlightenment is much more in the context of particularly the prefrontal cortex and the forebrain in general, which gives a context to things, gives more awareness to things. So, okay, sounds so far so good, that there are two kinds of desire. It's certainly a more coherent view of Buddhism and its path, and it's not so dependent on the monastic lay division, perhaps crucially. But there were still a lot of difficulties with that view, I think, that there were two kinds of desire. And one of the biggest ones is just, really, is it that neat? Can we tell from the desire itself whether we're in good desire or bad desire? And if you start thinking about examples, that becomes clearer. So supposing I want to buy books, I'm in a bookshop. I want to buy books, maybe they're books about Buddhism or something else that's helpful. Is that just a totally healthy, progressive application of my desire for enlightenment, as it were, the path? Or is it just about my craving to have a nice book collection? And very often our motives are mixed. It's very difficult to differentiate whether our desires are good or bad in themselves. So the same applies to very much to things like food and sex. How can we differentiate between what's supposedly healthy and what isn't? So very often the differentiation between what's desire for enlightenment or what isn't seems to be very ad hoc. So maybe with the benefit of lots of hindsight, we could tell, because we could tell what led to enlightenment and what didn't. But when we're in it, when we're making our judgments and when we're responding to the desires we feel, it's not at all clear. So how is that going to help us? And there's also the issue: are those desires really separate? I very much doubt whether the desires themselves are as clearly separated or separable as that. And so it involves a kind of discontinuity, and I think discontinuity, the imposition of discontinuous ideas on things, is often a sign of an absolutizing way of thinking. Whereas desire itself is much more ambiguous and incremental. Obviously, some desires are better than others in context. But whether we can tell in most cases is much more tricky. And it really seems to be the relationship between our desires and the beliefs that they are associated with that is much more helpful in differentiating what's a helpful desire and what isn't. Okay, so that's, if you like, the second model, which is probably the one that you will hear from well-informed modern Western Buddhists who give you an account of what's happening. Buddhist teachers, maybe. Even though I think there are inconsistencies between that and a lot of what Buddhism relies on implicitly, which is the first model. I think there's a much better third model, which I would call the integration model. So in that third model, there aren't good and bad desires. There are just desires. And it's not the type of desire or the object of desire that's the issue. It's conflict between desires. So I think this is a model which we can, well, perhaps has become available to us from the beginning of psychoanalysis and that sort of stream of thinking, which has been developed in subsequent therapeutic contexts. So increasingly in that way of thinking, a lot of what therapists are sometimes identifying at least is conflict of one kind or another, and the value of overcoming conflict within ourselves becomes obvious. You can also see that same conflict socially. So the conflict between desires is also the conflict between people who have different desires. So many of the properties of craving and what we might see as bad desire, if you think about it, are conflicting. They're about conflict. So and things that we would consider unethical are often attributable to conflict of some kind. So if you think about the 5 precepts, which I talked about in the last talk, what's wrong with stealing, for example? Well, that's going to lead you into conflict, isn't it, with other people whose property you're taking. Or non-consensual sex, obviously that's about long-term conflict, not only with others, also with yourself and your own self-respect and your feelings for others. What about something like a traditional vice like gluttony, eating too much? Well, we feel bad about it afterwards, so the desires that we have now are in conflict with the desires we have later. So if we see our desires over a period of time and reflect on them and try and look at them in an integrative way, then I think we can understand the basic issue with desire as being about conflicts of desire. And I think that needs to, there are roots of that, or there are ways of getting to that in connection with the Buddhist account, particularly when we start thinking about the middle way and what's required to practice the middle way, if the middle way is avoiding absolutization, because the discontinuous division between good and bad desires seems to me like an absolutization. It's getting in the way, really, of our understanding what's happening. And discontinuity is often a feature of absolutization. So you may ask, well, what about long-term sort of healthy desires? So something like giving up smoking, for example. That's a desire which is obviously better in some ways than a desire to smoke, but it's better because it's sustainable, and in the end, it has the potential to resolve the conflict between the desire to smoke and the desire to give up smoking. So seeing the problem with desire as being one of conflict doesn't mean that some desires aren't better than others, because some desires have the potential to overcome conflict. So we might go with the more sustainable desires, the more long-term desires, in order to be able to resolve our conflicts in the longer term. Okay, so just to kind of summarize what I've said so far about craving, before I go on to karma, I've got a chart here which should make it clearer. So 3 interpretations of craving. Actually, here I've called them Platonic model, rather than Nirvanic model. Okay, so Platonic model, Abhidharmic model, and the integration model. So in the Platonic model, there's only one type of desire. All desire is bad. It's basically an anti-body view. Enlightenment then becomes only possible without a body, without being reborn. But enlightenment becomes impossibly demanding, hence the monastic lay split, and it seems in conflict with embodied practice. The Abhidharmic model, however, is an advance on that, because there are 2 types of desire, good and bad desires. So it does become possible then to understand the idea of enlightenment with the body, but it does assume that good and bad desires are distinguishable, and really I think neglects the ambiguity of desire. How we actually experience desire is much more ambiguous than that. So in practice, I think an integration model is much more helpful, where there's one kind of desire is good, nothing wrong with desire in itself, so it's conflicts between desires that are bad, because those are associated with absolutization and with reinforcing feedback loops. So if we start looking into this, the desires we see as bad are usually unsustainable desires. basically, as a model, I think that this is much more focused on the path rather than enlightenment. So it's consistent with what I argued in the second talk, which is that the middle way needs to come first, and rather than adopting top-down interpretations of the Buddhist path, which start with a view of enlightenment and make the middle way fit into it, we need to start with the middle way as the way in which we interpret the path. So interpreting craving in relation to the path, I think, would best fit the integration model as something that fits our experience of desire, having bodies. Okay, so that's enough on craving for now. Let me go on to karma and say a little bit at least about karma, because that's a central issue for Buddhists, and it's something that's stressed a lot in traditional Buddhism. So karma, literally, to just run over some of the basics, the word karma literally means action, but it's a contraction really of karma vipaka, which means the fruits or ripening of action. So the term karma usually refers to the effects of action, and particularly of willed or deliberate action, as they come back to us according to Buddhist tradition. Karma is I think in most Buddhists that you ever speak to about this, it's widely understood in what I would call a top-down way. So there's a top-down interpretation of it, which basically tells us about karma as a kind of cosmic system that we could only really know about because the enlightened have told us about it. Yeah, so there's a sort of appeal to authority involved in that, and so really, kind of law of karma it involves the claim that the moral complexion of our action, depending on how good or bad it is, creates a proportionate effect. So at some point, you will be rewarded or punished, as it were, not by a person, but by the universe, as it will, by the processes of conditions, in a proportionate way for the way in which you have acted here meaning mentally as well as physically. So it's really the mental act which is the crucial one, rather than just the physical act. But obviously this is also associated very much with the more helpful idea that we get into particular entrenched habits which tend to have effects on us in the future. So that's an observation which is far from unique to Buddhism, but Buddhists tend to associate it with karma and the idea that actions have consequences, so that whatever we do, however we think about things, however we judge things, is likely to have an effect. Yeah, that's a basic point which almost nobody will disagree with on reflection. You don't have to be a Buddhist or accept other Buddhist doctrines to think that. But maybe to take it seriously and to make it part of your practice, is still a demanding thing, whatever standpoint you come from. Now, a common traditional interpretation of that top-down view of karma is also retrospective, what I would call retrospective. So that is, it's believed that we can look at how we are now, or particularly how we were born, or the conditions that we have come into, and conclude that was because of our previous deeds. Yeah, so in the retrospective view of karma, which is shared with Hinduism, there's this ability which is opened up, I think, socially, to blame people, or to use karma to blame people for the position that they're in. Whether that's obviously to do with caste or disability or whatever. So there are various uses of the idea of karma which really don't fit with our sort of modern conceptions of human equality or human rights or any of that stuff. But even without that retrospective interpretation, karma is still making a top-down view of karma is still making a big claim, and that's basically a claim about cosmic justice. So even if you're only looking prospectively, even if you're only looking at what you do from now onwards and the effect it's going to have, if you really believe in the traditional form of karma, then you will believe that it is inevitable that the moral complexion of your actions now will be reflected in future in a proportionate way. You won't know exactly when it will affect you or how it will affect you in future, just that it will be proportionate. So according to that view, even if it's the more sort of reformed prospective view, even if you avoid, supporting the caste system and that kind of thing, you've still got to believe that these effects will necessarily happen to you. They may happen at any time. So I think that tends to lead to a lot of ad hoc reasoning. If you want to make any use of this belief in karma, then you have to be able to apply it to examples. And of course, the temptation then is that if a particular effect that we encounter, something that happens to us, seems deserved, then we attribute it to karma. Yeah, so that guy next door was nasty to his wife. His wife left him. Well, he deserved it, didn't he? That was his karma. So we attribute it to karma if it seems like that. But then, of course, there are lots of other things that don't seem to be karma. Is COVID karma? Is that somebody's fault? Somebody gets COVID? So obviously in the more modern, reformed, prospective view of karma, there's a recognition of other kinds of conditions that do affect people. So people do get ill and it's not necessarily their fault, for example. But nevertheless, everything you do will have a proportionate effect. So either way, there's still an absolutization packed into that, I think. Another line that I hear about this from some Buddhists is more of an idealist interpretation. So they say, no, this isn't about a cosmic justice view of the universe. This is just about our minds and the mental effects of what we believe about what we do and so on. So somehow it's our minds that bring back the effects to us, not something that's happening out there. But that again is another absolute dogmatic view as far as I'm concerned. So there's no justification for idealism any more than there is for realism or materialism. Idealism is a dogmatic metaphysical view that we've got no grounds for on the basis of experience. We have no grounds to deny the reality, the possible reality of the world around us, the physical stuff around. So if you avoid cosmic justice beliefs, then you end up with idealism instead, it seems, in this way of thinking. Both of those approaches, I think, are incompatible with the middle way, which basically needs to avoid such absolute beliefs. Both of them are over interpretations of our experience. So we experience some deserved effects, or effects that seem to be deserved, but many that don't seem to be deserved. So nasty dictators, for example, may go into serene retirement, like Idi Amin had a happy retirement in Saudi Arabia, as far as I'm aware. So lots and lots of things happen which are not just, which are not fair. Lots and lots of things happen which seem to be tragic or which are the result of luck. None of that fits this understanding of the world as basically just. There's no evidence that causal processes are magically coordinated so that everything turns out just. If you imagine the vast scale of the coordination that's necessary to make sure that everything fits so that everybody gets their correct comeuppance. So there's an arrogance and there's a projection involved, I think, in assuming that the world is organised in that way to give us our just desserts. And all of this comes from a kind of top-down interpretation of this particular model, which I think had its inspiration probably in just helping people to take responsibility for their actions, which has that positive function. But it's been turned into a metaphysical dogma. It's also traditionally supposed to provide a motive for morality, for behaving better. But if you look at what motivates people morally, overwhelmingly it starts off with social conformity, the social ethics, and then as we develop, there are more complex forms of morality, reflective forms of morality, more universal forms of morality. But these are based on our developing awareness. They're not based on a sort of calculation of whether we will get our just desserts in future through the law of karma. So as a view of morality, it's terrifically simplistic and inadequate to psychology and inadequate to everything we understand about morality. And then there's the assumption that it rebounds to ourselves as individuals, which is a long-standing issue even within Buddhism. How do you reconcile karma and rebirth with anatta, with the probably best put as the recognition that we don't know whether or not we have a self, or non-essentialism. How do we reconcile as well? There's no obvious way of reconciling them, because it's supposed to be the individual that experiences karmic effects, and how that happens without the individual continuing to exist in some sense is extremely difficult to rationalize. And the belief in a just world like this creates conflict, I think. It creates internal conflict, particularly when we don't get what we feel we deserve. We've worked hard on something and we feel that the world ought to reward us for it. I've definitely felt that with a long struggle in the past with getting books published. I put a load of work into this book. Why on earth won't you publish it? But the world doesn't owe me anything at all. I've had to accept that. So we underestimate luck at our peril. And top-down karma and rebirth is in major conflict with Buddhism. However, there is, I think, an alternative view of karma which might be more useful. Whether you should call it karma, I think, is also debatable. But let's call it that for the sake of argument. So, as with craving, where I suggested there were 3 ways of interpreting it, here I'm going to suggest that there are 3 interpretations of karma. So you could call it as the top-down retrospective interpretation, where there's the top-down retrospective interpretation and top-down prospective interpretation. So those share quite a lot, really. They're both absolute sorts of views about karma, that you'll get the proportionate effects for your actions. But the difference is just about whether you can blame people for their previous deeds. But the third view, which I'm going to suggest is more helpful, is what you might call bottom-up karma. There we have to let go entirely of the idea that karma offers inevitable effects, or that there's a law of karma. So yes, there are traceable effects of our actions, not only in the world around us, but also neurally. Every time we make a particular sort of judgment, we create deeper neural tracks. So it means that similar sorts of judgments are more likely in future. If we're more rigid in our thinking, well, we're more likely to make more rigidity for ourselves. It's the reinforcing feedback loop. If we're more aware, then maybe this will create the conditions for more awareness. So there can be many cases where acting in a good way leads to good effects. just not inevitable, that's all. And we're constrained by many other conditions. And the effects of our actions don't necessarily rebound on us as individuals. They may affect other people as well. In fact, they're very likely to. In this bottom-up view of karma, we'd have to let go of cosmic justice or injustice. So it wouldn't be a question of believing that the universe is unjust, just that we just don't know anything about its justice. We'd have to interpret rebirth as a metaphor really for closed feedback loops. It's another way of talking about closed feedback loops, or reinforcing feedback loops. And really see the middle way as the kind of practice that's more likely to lead to good effects in the long run. Okay, so you could take that view of karma, and is it karma? Has it got anything to do with karma? I think that's a very debatable question. But if you are looking for a view of karma or an interpretation of karma which is compatible with the middle way, let alone with science or any other sets of considerations in the modern world, I think that's a possibility. But I think you need to be careful with how you use the term well, because obviously lots of people will just assume that you mean the top-down version if you use the term karma. So I can't see a lot of justification really for using the term. But that doesn't mean at all that we shouldn't take our experience of actions having consequences very seriously. And indeed that we really expect our actions to have consequences, whether for us or for others, and really expect better actions and more open, aware ways of thinking to have better consequences. Then that's obviously a helpful expectation to have. Yeah, so there's an interesting passage in my book, which I won't have time to quote you now, but basically it's about the idea that karma is as inevitable as a stone. If you throw a stone into a pond, it's as inevitable that it will fall as that karma will occur, the karmic effects will occur. And when I read that passage when I was writing the book, The Buddha's Middle Way, I immediately thought, pumice. What if that stone were to float? Yeah. Although there are passages in the Pali Canon that suggest that karma is inevitable, karmic effects are inevitable, I think if we interpret them in that sort of way, thinking, oh, actually, whether or not it was intended, there are exceptions to whether stone will sink in a pond. Sometimes it may float. That's the case with karma as well. Sometimes unexpected things will happen. Okay, and then I'm going to be very quick about the last of my three things. So, conditionality, or paticca samuppada. Now, there's a very similar situation with this whole idea. There are top-down approaches to it and there are bottom-up approaches to it. So sometimes it's discussed in a very top-down way as a kind of truth about the universe, that all phenomena are conditioned. I don't think we can possibly know that. However, it does fit our experience that things are all related to each other overwhelmingly. It very much fits systems theory, the understanding of things in terms of their relationships with each other. So they affect each other. But to be useful, the idea of conditionality has to be applied to specific conditional relationships, not just asserted as a top-down belief about how things are. And if we theorize about specific relationships between things, then we can test them out and see whether they're justified or not, which has obviously got a lot to do with the scientific method and approach. So very often I think conditionality is a placeholder for provisionality, because in practice, if we are trying to be conditional about the way we approach things, that means we have to be provisional in the ways we approach things, which means that we don't hold absolute views about them, and we don't start off with an absolute view, but we do have a theory perhaps, and we try and check out and adjust that theory in relation to our experience. So to take that view of conditionality, we need to start off with the middle way as prior. Okay, and obviously the issue, I think, with conditionality as it's often presented in Buddhism is that it's done in a rather rigid way. So the 12 Nidanas in the Theravada particularly are presented often as what conditionality is. But they're just a specific example of a specific chain of conditional relationships, far from the only possible understanding of those relationships even. Okay, so basically the theme of all of those three things I've been talking about is been the middle way needs to come first in our interpretation of Buddhism. There's also perhaps a bit of a theme here that fits in with the need for provisionality, which is compatible with scientific method, certainly at its best. I don't see this as simply a scientific approach, but I see it as one that's compatible with the best of what science does. So very often the dogmas that I'm objecting to here are partly that, because they're pre-scientific. So top-down and ad hoc approaches, they're not just bad scientific method, they're also bad practice more generally. We can avoid those kinds of ways of approaching craving and karma and conditionality by not interpreting them absolutely. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I'm way out of time. But see, we have a question from Keith. So thanks for that, Keith. So is the middle way in part opening up to the possibilities of a way to be, using the new information we can become aware of? Yeah, it depends partly what you mean by a way to be. I suppose I'd rather say a way to judge, a way to respond to our experience. But certainly, yes, using new information we can become aware of, yes, in every respect. So whether that's information in the traditional sense of cognitive, in a cognitive form, or whether it's new emotional or imaginative access of some kind. Okay, yeah. So I think the answer generally to your question, though, is yes, Keith. Okay, and thanks for the appreciation as well, though. Okay, assuming that's all the questions then. So just to round off then, so my final talk in this series will be in a week's time, when I will be talking about the Buddha as an archetype, or the archetypal interpretation of the Buddha. So that particularly means ways that we can be inspired by the idea, by the stories of the Buddha, by the image of the Buddha. So there'll be some connection there with questions really about images of the Buddha and the stories, the use of stories of the Buddha in Buddhism, and indeed of ritual, the ritualistic use of the Buddha, and going for refuge and all that kind of stuff, faith in the Buddha. Is there any place for that? Does the middle way allow us to engage in those things? And I think you can guess the answer to that. In broadly speaking, is always going to be, is it bottom up? Is it compatible with experience rather than imposed on that experience? Okay, so more on that in a week's time. And in the meantime, just a reminder also, if you are interested in buying the book, The Buddha's Middle Way, the best way to do that is to go to the Equinox website. So if you search Equinox publishers and find the book on there, you can buy the book at a discount if you put in the code EQX, so you can get a 25% discount off the book there in the paperback. Okay, so that's it for now, and see you next week.